Welcome back to the Astrology Report, this time for September 25th through October 1st of 2023. My name is Cam White. We have a awesome and very big week ahead, so let's just jump straight into it. We're starting Monday out with the moon making a square to Jupiter while the moon is still in Aquarius. And one of the bigger highlights that we have on Monday is going to be Mercury making a trine to Jupiter. This is Mercury's third trine to Jupiter during this whole Mercury, being in shadow, retrograde, and then leaving shadow situation. So I really like Mercury trine Jupiter. Moon squaring Jupiter is not the worst thing in the world, but when we're talking about the moon being in Aquarius, again, a little bit more connected to society on an emotional level. There is a level of detachment with the moon in Aquarius. Again, it's like Saturn's sign. So like emotions are a little bit more reserved or cut off, but with it being in Aquarius, it's like the cold intellectual side of our personas and how our emotions can connect to that. And I just look at the moon squaring Jupiter as a sort of a frustration of things not, again, moving as fast as maybe that you want them to be. The way I would look at the moon making a square to Jupiter this time around, though, is the moon being in Aquarius is in the superior position to Jupiter in this situation. So the moon's kind of controlling the situation. And I look at the moon in Aquarius squaring Jupiter, it's like, how can you just gain a bigger perspective of the situation? With Jupiter now retrograde, it's still moving really slow. Like it's not really speeding up in terms of its speed. But how can you take a bird's eye view of the situation in terms of the slow growth, in terms of what needs to change, in terms of, again, lately I've been getting a lot of good feedback on how I've been talking about Jupiter and that it's not always this, amazing and good planet. And it can be. Like if there is a planet that is going to symbolize, again, abundance and fortune and good opportunities, it's going to be Jupiter. But at the minimum, Jupiter is going to expand whatever house it's in. And it's going to, if Jupiter rules like philosophy and faith, whatever house Jupiter's transiting in your birth chart is going to show you that house and be like, what do you believe about this? Let's look at this a little bit more in depth. And so Jupiter's in Taurus. We're talking about security, stability, wealth, feeling grounded. And I think as the moon makes that square to Jupiter, it's like, how can you look at that situation with a more of a bird's eye view, with a more detached perspective? And what I like about that is also on Monday, Mercury makes this trine to Jupiter, where, I've talked a lot about this being a good Mercury retrograde, and I've gotten some comments like, this is the worst Mercury retrograde ever, Cameron, you're so wrong. And it's like, well, it's still a Mercury retrograde. Something that I like to preface things with when it comes to like my consultations, and maybe I need to say this more in my videos, is like there is an on paper situation. For example, I can get 3 people with the same birth chart and they're all going to have completely different lives and different contexts for their birth chart to play out. So when I say like, hey, this is what it looks like on paper, but this could look a lot different in real life, given the context. And when you do a consultation with me, we only have an hour together. So trying to figure out the exact specifics, like if you've been coming to me for a while, we're usually pretty tuned in on certain specific things, but some people may just not feel ready, or they may not understand a certain piece of information is important context for me to make a certain prediction, or how tuned in they are into just a situation in and of itself. But Jupiter is just going to show you, at the minimum, an area of your life that you need to think about deeper. And it isn't always good, but there's a good thing that comes out of Jupiter, right? Like when you do talk about faith and opportunities, sometimes that does come through a crisis. It's not always like, oh, let's look at your faith and your belief in the world because your life is so great and everything's so easy. It's like life gets really, really hard at times, and that requires you to think deeper about your faith and what you do trust and what you do value and what makes you feel more security in your life. And like I said, with Mercury making this trine to Jupiter, like on paper, this is really good. On paper, this is one of the better Mercury retrogrades that we've had in a long time. That doesn't mean we're completely, taking away any ill effects of Mercury. But as Mercury does make this trine to Jupiter, there is a solution here. There is a realization of how things can be done. There is I don't really like using the word realization, but if Mercury is, again, communication, logistics, planning, all of that kind of good stuff, and it's in its domicile, it's exalted, it's very, very dignified, and it's making this trine to Jupiter where it's like, what are things that you can do now that create a lot more sustainability? And I know that word sustainability gets thrown around a lot and people don't really know what that means, but it's like, sometimes the best way isn't like, do you want to work smarter or do you want to work harder? And sometimes working smarter means taking your time with things. You can have it fast or you can have it good. And I just look at Mercury trining Jupiter as being able to connect those two dots in your life. It's like, okay, well, if Mercury is like what your plan is, what you're thinking about, what you want to communicate, what you're more immediately trying to change. Like Mercury just goes really, really fast. It's a lot closer to us. So it's much more like microcosm versus Jupiter is a little bit more macrocosm. Mercury just trining Jupiter is just kind of understanding the bigger picture here. It's like, okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And sure, it might take a little bit more time, but it's worth that amount of time. Like, there's something to be said about earning like a lot of money versus like being given a lot of money. Like, like people who win the lottery, they lose all their money within like a couple years versus people that have like created that wealth, who have worked for that wealth, typically hold on to it. Again, that's just more of a generality. But that's the way I kind of look at Mercury trining Jupiter, is that there is a way to, get what you need to get done, get the results that you want. And sometimes the slower way is more valuable, and that it will create more wealth. And sure, it may not be as fast as you want it to be, but it's the right way. It is the way. So I just look at Monday with Mercury trining Jupiter and the moon making that square to Jupiter is allowing yourself to take a step back, look at the bigger picture and see that, hey, if you just follow the plan, stick to the plan, you can get where you want to go. It's just not going to be overnight. So then we get to Tuesday. And Tuesday, the moon's kind of doing a lot of stuff here. It's first going to make a trine to Mars. Then it is going to go opposite Venus. Then it is going to square Uranus. Then it will ingress into Pisces and conjoin Saturn. So the moon making a trine to Mars, emotions connected with, how we, argue, how we fight, how we, what motivates us. Emotional factors are really important when it comes to motivation. Mars is going to be like your ambition and your drive and everything like that. And Mars is in detriment, right? And there is, of course, like the word detriment means like something bad. And so, of course, there is like a negative to it. But the moon in Aquarius trining Mars in Libra, something Mars in Libra is good for is like doing things for other people. Sure, that may not be the way Mars wants to do things, but I look at the moon making this trine to Mars as like, hey, connect yourself to the bigger picture here. Connect yourself to the people around you. What is going to work more in favor of them and not necessarily your own interests, but for everyone's best interests. And so the moon trining Mars, I think, is just much more of a feeling a little bit more connected with people's opinions, people's emotion around a certain subject, whether it's your family, your friends, your audience, like my situation. And the moon making that trine to Mars is just having a more of an emotional rationale as to why you should do X and not Y. And that X factor, that reason why, or that thing that you should do is going to be more related to disarming yourself, surrendering to things, making things a lot more peaceful, not necessarily looking to be combative with situations. But then the moon goes opposite Venus, where Venus is still in shadow. We have a lot going on with Venus this week, as we'll get to Friday. Friday is really the big day this week. And the moon opposite Venus is a struggle, because the moon opposite, again, Venus in Leo, Venus has been in Leo for 15,000 years now. And Venus, love, fun, connection, romance, indulgence. She's in Leo. She wants to be the pop star. She wants the attention. But the moon is opposite it. Our emotions are connected more to the audience. And there's times to listen to your audience, and there's times to not listen to your audience. There's times to be more connected and to not be as connected. And I look at the moon opposite Venus as that tension being very, very relevant. And one part of me is like, okay, the moon trining Mars, there is a negotiation factor. There's things that you can change and do for the sake of other people that may not necessarily be the thing that you want to do. But then when the moon goes opposite Venus, it's like, it's you got to know where to draw that line. Because if you're doing everything to cater or pander to your audience, and you're not doing the thing that like you want to do, then like what's the fun in it? What is the joy in it? And maybe for some people, it's like some people enjoy being actors for the like the attention, and not necessarily so much for like the art itself, if that makes sense. And so there's no right or wrong answer here. It just really depends on your situation and who you are. But the moon opposite Venus is there's an opposing force. And that's Venus is like, well, I want to be seen. I want to be in the spotlight. I want to be the center of attention. But the moon is requiring you to maybe tone that down a little bit, maybe require you to be more blended in with the crowd, maybe step into the crowd a little bit more. And so the moon making that trine to Mars at first is like, hey, I'll work with other people, but then the moon goes opposite Venus. And another part of that is like, okay, well, how much do I really need to do things for other people? And where does that involve myself? Or where do I involve myself with that? And so, I mean, also the moon just opposite Venus is very like, is this what I want? Am I doing things for the sake of emotion that doesn't really align with my values? And that could be a good learning opportunity. All of life is a learning opportunity. You might be like, you know what? I'm going to listen to my emotions and do this. And then later on, you might go, I wish I didn't do that. I wish I didn't feel so emotionally compelled to do something I know I didn't want to do in the beginning. So I look at the moon opposite Venus as a really good time to like just check in with that with yourself. Is like, okay, is this just like an emotional pulling towards something that you feel compelled to do that you really don't want to do? Or is this something that you're like, hey, I don't mind doing this. I think this is the right thing and I value this. But then the moon will make a square to Uranus. And I just love the moon in Aquarius making a square to Uranus, where it's kind of like my favorite example, and it's a cartoonist version. If you've ever seen Hot Rod's one of my favorite movies of all time. And it's a total, if you've never seen it before, I would really recommend seeing it because it's really, really funny. And it's like how Andy Samberg's like big part of his career started. But there's the scene where it's like, the kind of the climax of the movie. They're walking to the big event that's going to be the climax. And it's like a montage. So there's like music playing. And then, they're just walking. And then all of a sudden this like crowd joins in. And it's like this like big city event. And they're all kind of confused. And it's all really cool. And everyone's singing. And then someone just like throws a trash can. And then like a fucking riot starts out of nowhere. That's what the moon in Aquarius reminds me of. Squaring, when it gets to that square with Uranus. It's like, it doesn't take much for a group like the hive mind to go from like, hey, we're all in this together to just complete chaos. So I do look at the moon in Aquarius making that square to Uranus is like a major disruption to that, again, to that connection, to that order. And so just expect things to not necessarily go as smooth. For example, I think I've talked about this. I don't know if I've talked about this. I've shared a lot of the personal development programs I took. The first one I ever did, it was like this 3-day course. Someone asked if I did, it was called Psi Seminars. For one, now I have friends that still are in that space. I would not recommend them. I don't really care for the company, and I don't really think it's good work for everyone to do. But for me at that time, it was really, really good for me. And I got a lot out of it because I put a lot into it, which a lot of people don't put their, you get what you give, and a lot of people don't give it all, so they don't get a lot out of it. But nonetheless, the first seminar I did, there was a situation in which the bigger cohort of people were split into 2 groups, and we were going to play a game. And the idea of the game is how you play this game is how you play your life. And at first I was like, okay, whatever. Like that's probably bullshit. But then later on after this whole event, I was like, holy shit, that's exactly how I live my life. And what had happened was I went into this one group and everyone was like, who's going to be like the leader? And I was like moving this board because the game was kind of like on this board, and I was moving the board to the front. And everyone was like, oh, Cameron, you'll be the leader. You're like right there. And I was like, oh, perfect. Okay. And what I should have done was been a leader, said, okay, here's my idea, my plan. Let's do this. But you know what I did? I said, what do you guys think we should do? And it just turned into chaos. I mean, people were crying. People were like leaving and yelling at each other because no one agreed on how we were supposed to do things, even though we were all on this team. And I say that because it's just kind of like there's a certain place like, and that was such a big lesson for me. That lesson still terrifies me to this day of like, wow, that is a situation I find myself in a lot. But in that Aquarius kind of that crowd thing, it's like, well, if we just direct everything like, oh, what should all of the crowd things do? It's like, well, everyone's going to have different opinions and everyone's going to have a different way of looking at things. And then no one's really going to agree. And even though we're all on the same team, no one has an actual solution that we can all agree on unless someone steps up as a leader and says, hey, this is what we're going to do. You're just going to kind of go with it, sort of a thing. And so that's how I look at a lot of like the moon and Aquarius stuff. And it squares Uranus. So it's like the perfect example is just me being like, what do you guys think we should do? And then it got so chaotic, and then they kicked me off. They were like, all right, Cameron, you're not the leader anymore. Fucking go away. And I was like, I mean, I was checked out after that. Like, I was just like, is that really how I handled that situation? And I still think about that a lot. But anyway, Moon in Aquarius squaring Uranus. If all of the decisions are based on everybody else, like no one's going to agree and everything's just going to be, chaos is going to erupt. So anyway, Moon squares Uranus, we have some disruption, and then the moon, will be kind of like void for a little while, and then it will ingress into Pisces and conjoin Saturn, where now that the moon's in Pisces, there's a little bit more of the connection to the inner spirit, to our inner faith, and it's going to conjoin Saturn, where, again, continuing off that analogy, after we played that game, it was kind of like they teed us up to say we weren't allowed to speak to anyone else for the rest of the night, and we were supposed to go home and journal how the way that we played that game shows up in our lives. And that was just such a big takeaway for me, and it made me realize it gave me a lot more awareness of how I handle a situation. It made me be like, I don't ever want to be in that situation again. And I look at that similarly to the moon going into Pisces and conjoining Saturn, is like taking quiet time to reflect on what that situation was, with the moon conjoining Saturn being like, okay, where do we need to get real about that? Where do we need to get more serious about that? How could we have handled that more maturely? Because I could sit here and go, well, I wasn't supposed to be up there anyway, and it was this guy's fault. But the tee up was, hey, how you play this game is how you play your life. Go home and, journal about your experience playing the game and how else that shows up in your life. And if you were being honest with yourself with it, which, in this kind of situation, a lot of people were, or at least to a varying degree. I can't speak for everybody else, but for me, I was very, very honest. That work was really, really good for me at that time. And it just made me really look, being like, I can't believe how little self-awareness I had of that situation. I was just going with the flow. I was just like, oh, we could just do what everybody else wants to do. And, we'll all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And that's just not how it worked. So the thing is, the moon goes into Pisces and conjoins Saturn. It's like, let's reflect on that situation. After the moon trines Mars, goes opposite Venus, squares Uranus, and then goes into Pisces and conjoins Saturn. It's like, okay, that was a lot of lunar transits. There was a lot of back and forth here. How can we reflect on that and get a little bit more serious about it? How do we not be so aloof? How do we not be so oblivious to a situation? And how can we be more mature of our inner emotions, and our own inner faith? Like, I was just speaking about this to a client, I believe yesterday, about the difference between Sagittarius and Pisces. Is like, Sagittarius is very like, oh, this is my goal and this is where I want to go. And this is, who I want to become. And it's like, okay, Pisces is like, well, who do you have to be to get there? Who do you have to become to achieve X, Y, and Z? Who do you have to be in order to live that life that you want to live? And that Pisces just requires, like, anyone can go from point A to point B, but, and this is something Alex Hormozy says a lot of the time that I really, really resonate with, which is the work works on you more than you work on it. And I just look at that with the Pisces stuff as like, there's this internalization of like the spirit and the more like feminine, more internal part of the spirit that like requires you to be something different in order to get where you want to go. Like with where you are now is not where you want to be. So you're not going to be who you are right now when you get to where you want to be. And the Pisces part of it is like, who do you have to become to be that? And that's how I look at this moon conjoining Saturn on Tuesday. It's like, there's this real, just deep look at who you are in this moment and how that needs to change to who you want to become. We get to Wednesday, the moon is going to make a sextile to Jupiter and it will go opposite Mercury. I think this is interesting because the moon making that in Pisces, making that sextile to Jupiter is essentially just saying like, okay, I understand that I'm in a state of flux right now. My emotions are a little bit more connected to my faith and my spirit and the internalization of things. And it's sextiling Jupiter. This is a part of the growth. This is a part of the process, but it'll go opposite Mercury, where again, Mercury just wants a solution right here, right now. But, people, for example, I saw a thing the other day on Instagram where it's like, people don't want help. People want attention. And this is something that I talk a lot about and I still get a lot of pushback from, but maybe one day you guys will learn like the difference between being a victim and the victim mindset. Like, anyone can, we're all fucking victims of something. We all have our stories and we all have our past experiences, but there's a certain time, or I don't even say time, but oftentimes, we can hold on to those events and create these stories around them that we base our whole lives off of. And that doesn't have to be the case. But you'll see people who say like, oh, I have X, Y, and Z problem, or I have this, and this problem. And then you go, okay, well, here's like the solution. Like, do you want help? And they don't want the help. They just want the attention of being the victim. And you can call that a trauma response. You can call that whatever. But the fact is, that is something that happens. And I look at that moon in Pisces opposite Mercury and Virgo as like, hey, well, Mercury and Virgo here has a solution. Mercury and Virgo here has an idea or a plan, but the moon in Pisces is like, well, that's not good enough. Or, I don't really want that. And I don't actually want to make the changes. I'm just a little all over the place. So I'd really recommend on Wednesday, just trying to catch yourself being avoidant of a situation, of not being present in that moment and being too lost internally to like actually see, the forest through the trees. There will be an opposing force in that situation where it will require you, like, for people that struggle with ADHD. And when I say struggle with that, it's just kind of like, I don't need to get into my opinions about it, but long story short, it doesn't surprise me that no one can pay attention nowadays, because look at how fucking stimulating this whole world is. We're literally like pretty much animals. This is all a lot for us to handle. But sometimes it requires you to, like, I remember being in class and there was just times like I just couldn't focus. Like, I don't care what the teacher's saying. I'm over here, I'm over there. And there was like this real weird avoidance. It didn't go away, and I wasn't able to focus until I calmed myself down. And I just like really, took a deep breath, centered myself, opened up my mind, and paid a little bit more attention. And that's kind of, I think, the solution on Wednesday is just, it's going to be easy to be scatterbrained and over here and over there. And 1 minute you're happy, 1 minute you're sad. But if you just look at things, or I should say, it's not even just like look at things like you're forced to look, but just take a deep breath, center yourself, and then allow yourself to see the solution, I think things will become a lot easier. We get into Thursday, the moon will make a sextile to Uranus and it'll conjoin Neptune. So again, sextile Uranus, I don't really, again, I always talk shit about the outer planets. The ones that don't matter to me the most are a sextile. Like, okay, moon's going to sextile Uranus. Some, spark of a random event that's going to be super subtle. What I do care more about when it comes to outer planets is going to be like a square or a conjunction, sometimes an opposition too, depending on the context. But a square and a conjunction matters a little bit more to me. But the moon's going to conjoin Neptune. So there is this kind of like, hey, am I, again, seeing the forest through the trees? Am I, seeing everything with rose-colored glasses right now? Am I being sold on something that is false? And so the moon conjoining Neptune will make you kind of question if you are seeing things clearly, if you are seeing things correctly, feeling a little too oversaturated, a little bit too lost in the sauce. If you want a more positive take on that, I think what the moon conjoining Neptune is really good for is like, at times, and I'm guilty of this, where it's really easy for me to be like not optimistic. Not optimistic isn't the right word, but like not being able to expand my mind and possibilities. Like I'm so like, no, this is the only way it can work, and this is the only way it can be. And that works for me in some situations, but other times it doesn't work for me. And so the moon conjoining Neptune can be a really good time for like seeing other possibilities, envisioning a different situation, allowing your emotions about something to dissolve and be a little bit more broadened. It's just that it's very vulnerable to like deception. So you got to make sure you know what boat you're in here. But then the moon will ingress into Aries, again, charged up. It's like after the moon conjoins Neptune, where we might be a little bit, delulu. Moon goes into Aries, where it's like, oh, that was... Well, it's like when you watch a movie, you go watch the movie and then all of a sudden it's like you become the main character. You're like, that guy is me, or, and then the moon goes into Aries, you leave the movie theater and you're like, you feel like you were that character. Like you went through that with them and that you embodied all of those emotions. So you feel more like you can act upon them. And that's how I look at the moon ingressing into Aries, is that there's this emotional charge to things after we kind of see a bigger picture or get a little bit lost in the sauce and have a better look at what our vision is. And then we get to Friday. Friday is the big day. Friday is the full moon in Aries, which shout out to Peyton. This is a pseudo eclipse. It is very, very, very close to being an eclipse, although it is not. Venus is going to make a square to Uranus and Mercury leaves shadow. I just talked about this on my Patreon. We do a live monthly overview of each month, and I kind of first talked about September. And this full moon is a real interesting hack in terms of being able to experience like eclipse energy without it being an eclipse, because this is a lunation in the same sign as the nodes. Like, it's pretty fucking close. But the full moon in Aries, the sun is fallen. The sun is not in its, it's not dignified right now. There is this like weaker willpower that we have at this moment. But this is the full moon in Aries where it's not conjoining Rahu, but damn, it's close. And I think a lot of this is like, okay, well, what actions do we need to take? Where do I need to get ready for the winter? The nighttime's getting, longer and longer. Do I have enough firewood? Do I have enough food to last me through the winter? What actions do I need to take now before it's too late? This full moon in Aries, I think, really highlights, again, what do we need to go for? What do we need to attack? Where do we feel so emotionally compelled and driven to go in a specific direction? My only caveat with that is Mars is going to conjoin the South Node. Mars rules the North Node. Mars rules this lunation, and it's not on K2 as of this moment, but it will be here very soon. And I look at this as like, what do we have to surrender? What do we have to give up? What do we have to move on from? And that's not something that happens till next week, but I think this full moon really gives us, I think the Mars South Node conjunction is one of the biggest highlights of this year, in my opinion. It's literally ruled by, the North Node. We're going to have eclipses here, and it's on the South Node in detriment. Like that's quite an interesting, set of events. But this full moon is really like, hey, emergency situation. I need to light, again, it's a full moon, lighting up the night, lighting up what we don't always get to see. And it's going to be in Aries. What actions do we need to take? But Mars, the planet of action, is in detriment in Libra, and it's conjoining the South Node. It's like, what actions do we need to stop taking? Where do we need to stop doing something? Where do we need to actually cut something off? Where do we actually need to surrender to a process and not necessarily fight it? But, it's one of those things that reminds me of like a riptide. It's like when you get sucked into a riptide in the ocean. I think it's what it's called, a riptide. Like, you don't want to fight it. You just go with it. And that's the way that you get out of the situation. And although we're not there yet, this is kind of like at least teeing us up for it. Venus squares Uranus, which is another interesting part of this to me, because the sun is ruled by Venus, the South Node and Mars are ruled by Venus, and Venus is going to square Uranus. This is our third square to Uranus, so we're literally done with it after this. But if Venus is, again, pleasure and value and fun, and she's in Leo and she wants to be seen, but squaring Uranus, there's more disruption, there's more changes. It's like, hey, maybe you need to make a drastic change. Venus squared Uranus when she was evening star, and so there was this disruption. Then she went retrograde and said like, oh, I don't really like this anymore. Venus went retrograde, squared Uranus again, where there was this kind of like, well, do I want this or do I want that? Is this how I want to go? And now Venus is morning star, moving forward and moving direct, and she's going to square Uranus, where it's like, maybe there needs to be another upending of something. Maybe there needs to be another wild disruption to something that needs to change. And Mercury leaves shadow on Friday. Friday's a very, very intense day. I love it. Give me the intense energy. I know a lot of people are always commenting like, when are things going to calm down? It's like, why would you want calm? Like, what do you want to just watch a boring movie, or would you rather watch a movie filled with narrative and story and excitement and turns and things like that? But Mercury leaves shadow. What I like about this, and this is another point for Saturday, because Mercury will trine Uranus, but Mercury leaves shadow. We're now finally mentally on a new subject. We're moving forward from all the stuff that we've had to rework and re-understand, and now mentally we're moving forward things with different plans, different ways of communicating, feeling more clear about all of those things, I think, is the most important part. But it's like this full moon with Venus squaring Uranus is with Mercury leaving shadow is like, there's a certain level of clarity and having a fresher mind about something where, hey, I realize what needs to happen, and yes, this requires a major disruption, or maybe the major disruption, Venus squaring Uranus, causes the illumination, causes the awareness of a situation. That's how I look at Fridays. A lot of being like, oh shit, like light bulb moment. Then we get to Saturday. The moon will then make this opposition to Mars. It will trine Venus. It will conjoin the North Node, and then it will ingress into Taurus, and it will sextile Saturn. A lot going on with the moon on Saturday. Also, Mercury trines Uranus. Let's talk about that for a moment. I love that Mercury leaves shadow and then trines Uranus, where it's like, all right, we just got to wrap all this up. We got to change all this infrastructure. And then boom, Mercury leaves shadow and then trines Uranus, where it's like, yes, that was the solution. That was the thing that was going to get us out of the situation. It's like sometimes you take risks on what you need to change and what you need to do. And when Mercury, and that's like very Mercury retrograde, right? And like sometimes you don't know if that is going to be the right solution or if that is going to give you the answer that you want. And it's not until like you do all of that and then like moments later, something happens where you're like, oh, sweet, I'm so glad I did that. Even though I was questioning that, even though I wasn't sure about it, I'm so glad I did that because it allowed for me to be in the best circumstance I could be for this upcoming situation that I did not see. And so I think Mercury trining Uranus is just kind of like that innovative solution, bright idea. And I think it's just more emphasized with the fact that Mercury leaves shadow and then trines Uranus, where it's like, going back and forth, and then it's like, all right, we're finally moving on, and then light bulb solution. It's like it has a very emotional equivalent to just like feeling constipated and just like letting it all out, where you're like, it's like just this much greater release than normal. But on Saturday, the moon will make this opposition to Mars, where, okay, we know what actions we need to take, but the moon in Aries being like, all right, do it now. But Mars in Libra is like, I don't want to. Like Mars in Libra is like, I don't know if maybe I'll put it off a little bit. It's not going to be easy. The moon in Aries is very like, do it now, do it now, do it. Mars in Libra is like, well, I got to do it at the right time. Is this the right moment? I don't know. The weather, how I feel. It's going to feel hard to know exactly when to press the button. After the moon goes opposite Mars, where maybe there's even like a little bit of a hasting pushing the button, but hey, sometimes you just got to do it. Maybe you're not going to be ready, but you got to do it anyway. The moon will make a trine to Venus, where the moon in Aries making a trine to Venus is like, the way I almost look at it is kind of like when you're hitting on someone. It's like, oh, do I do it? I don't know. I'm a little nervous, and you kind of do it. And it ends up kind of working out, even though you were like super nervous about it. That's like the moon opposite Mars. It's like, I don't know, am I reading the situation right? And then the moon makes that trine to Venus, where it's like, oh, it was recepted. It was, it opens the door for more fun and more confidence. Is how I'd like the moon trine Venus. And then the moon conjoins the North Node. I don't know why I took off my pen and just like circled that for some reason, as if I don't already see it. But then the moon conjoins the North Node, where there's this kind of like, it's like when you do one thing that you were really nervous about, and you're like, and it works out really well. Like, fuck yeah, I'm gonna do this now, and I'm gonna do that now. There's this hunger and this urge for more, and it's the moon in Aries. Like, I want to take assertive action. I want to be more aggressive. I want to be more like, I want to sink my teeth into this, and I want to sink my teeth into that. So Saturday gets kind of really intense with that, which could be good or bad depending on what kind of person you are. And then the moon ingresses into Taurus, and it will make that sextile to Saturn. So, emotionally, things get a little bit more calm. We feel a little bit more stable. And it's sextile Saturn. Again, the way I just look at that is a lot of the Saturn in Pisces is things are nuanced. Things are changing. How we learn, how we mature. And I say how we grow. I know Jupiter's more of like the growth-oriented planet, but I mean, growth can look like maturity. Growth can just look like more responsibility. And Saturn in Pisces, if you're talking about responsibility and maturity, it's very, more on the inward side, more of like, who do we have to be? And I think that moon and Taurus sextiling Saturn is like, hey, I feel a lot more comfortable with this, knowing how to be more responsible with how I have to be or who I have to be in order to go where I need to go. There's like a little bit of a check in here where you're like, I'm on the right path. And then Sunday, all we have got going on Sunday is this is the moon conjoining Jupiter. So I think there is a lot of like, enjoying the fruits of your labor. I think Sunday's a very relaxing day. The moon conjoining Jupiter, again, taking our time with things, really kind of having a more of an emotional connection to like, hey, it is okay if we take our time with things. It is okay that things are on this slow growth process, but you have to learn every single step of the way. So Sunday looks pretty chill, just moon Jupiter day. And then we get to next week. Next week, Mercury is going to go opposite Neptune. That's a little interesting. That's not the worst thing. Mars will conjoin the South Node, though. That is one of the bigger events, in my opinion. A lot of releasing, a lot of surrendering. Mercury enters Libra, where now there's like a mental shift onto the Libra dynamic. And then Venus leaves shadow and Venus enters Virgo next week. That is also one of the big major changes. We finally have Venus leaving this part of the sky and moving on to somewhere else, but she will go into her fallen sign of Virgo. So next week has a lot more of major changes. This week is more of like a finally feeling like we're moving forward week. Next week is like big change, big change, big change. So with that being said, make sure you like, comment, let me know what you guys are going through. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, if you want to keep up to date with all of the astrological weather. And with that being said, I'll see you guys next week.